In this lesson, we're going to carry on talking about the social policies and social ideas that we start to see between 1886 and 1914, just before the beginning of the First World War, focusing specifically on government legislation and local initiatives, looking at taxation and welfare, and looking at the extent to taxation and welfare reforms by 1914. This is going to be a lot of legislation that we're going to be talking about. There's lots of legislation that is passed between 1886 and 1914. It's quite a broad period of time, of course. And we're going to divide it into major areas of policy. So we're going to begin by thinking about health and sanitation. We're going to think about education reforms. We'll think about industrial and labor reforms. And we'll also then start talking about taxation and welfare reform by 1914, the final point on this particular specification. Now, some of these pieces of legislation we're going to be thinking about have already been examined and have already been touched upon previously, but this will just summarize a lot of the points that I want to make for this lesson. And it should just go without saying that initially, from the outset, government intervention in social policy grows considerably during this period. So there's quite a lot of legislation between 1886 and 1914, particularly with regard to those areas that I've just cited, the areas of public health, the areas of education, housing, and labour conditions. And so beginning then with thinking about public health and sanitation, by the late 19th century, we can see that the rise of industrialization and the urban growth in areas that are formidably becoming industrialized, places like Manchester, places like Birmingham and Sheffield, etc., are exacerbating problems with public health and sanitation. The overcrowding in these cities lead to poor living conditions, which then in turn leads to the outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhoid. This becomes a common problem and a common issue of this time. And to address these challenges then, a series of public health reforms are introduced. And these include the 1875 Public Health Act. While just before this period, if we're being technical, this act was still pivotal in laying the foundation for some of the more later reforms, given that it required local authorities to provide clean water, to regulate the disposal of sewage, and to improve general sanitation in urban areas. In 1890, we get the Housing and Working Classes Act, which allows local authorities to clear slums and to build new sanitary housing for urban poor. It generally represents a shift in policy from more laissez-faire attitudes towards the class system and class structures and social structures in urban environments to one of greater intervention when it comes to the housing market. Finally, we have the 1886 Labourers' Dwellings Act. This provides funds for local authorities in order to clear slums and to build affordable housing for rural workers, marking a beginning of government responsibility for public housing, although its impact was limited at the time. So these two final pieces of legislation that we see here, the Housing and Working Classes Act and the Labourers' Dwellings Act, concerned the role of and the increase in government intervention in housing practices and in the housing market, in building housing, in providing affordable housing for rural workers, which in and of itself is a public health and sanitation issue, given that with poor living conditions and poor housing conditions, especially given just how overpopulated and overcrowded a lot of these major urban cities were, comes with it issues of public health and sanitation, so cholera and typhoid, etc. Education was also a critical issue for the government, especially as the need for more educated workforce begins to grow with a deepening of the industrialization process. The British education system at the time was often very unequal, as we know already, and many working class children lacked access to adequate schooling. And so we see a number of major steps in terms of education. Slightly prior to this period again was the 1870 Elementary Education Act, sometimes also known as the Forster Act, that we noted in previous videos. It was the first significant step to provide free elementary education, and it additionally provided the establishment of school boards in areas where local authorities did not provide schooling, and ensured a basic education for all children. More specifically, then, we have the Balfour Act, or the 1902 Education Act, which allows local authorities to maintain and to build secondary schools and extend government grants to voluntary schools, mostly church-run voluntary schools. It increases, therefore, state involvement in education and addresses educational inequalities, although it still left significant gaps when thinking about access to education. And then finally, in 1907, we have the Education Administrative Provisions Act. This piece of legislation required the medical inspection of schoolchildren and began to address issues like child nutrition and child health, and were essential to improving educational outcomes. So we're starting to see a trend if we look at these pieces of legislation during this time period. And this is a trend towards a greater role that the government starts to play in the public affairs of things relating to public health, to sanitation, to housing, and to education, which goes with it the slow eventual growth of the welfare state. Not exactly in the kinds of place that it would be until after the Second World War, we start to see a greater role of the government in these kinds of welfare reforms as early as the 1880s. With the rise of new unionism and increased labour unrest as the result of industrialisation and the poor response from the government to industrial reforms, the government begins to pass several significant reforms that are aimed at improving the working conditions of the industrial labourers. This is particularly when it comes to those who are operating in often very dangerous and very exploitative jobs. This includes, for example, the Factory Acts. These were a series of pieces of legislation that included the 1878 Factory Act, which regulated child labour and set the limits on the number of hours children could work in factories. And then a few decades later, we get the Factories and Workshops Act of 1901, which extends these protections and introduces more rigorous inspections in terms of factory conditions. We also see that there is mining legislation, although very, very much passing earlier than our period that we're exploring. The Mines Act might be illustrative of a point relating to the passage of legislation in terms of protecting the mining industry. Although I would be careful to cite this as an example of legislative policy changes in the 1880s, because it wasn't in the 1880s; it was in the 1840s. But nevertheless, represents a growing trend towards greater regulation of these kinds of industries and areas. I would focus instead on the Factory Act of 1901 specifically. Furthermore, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain's taxation systems begin to evolve as well, particularly in response to the calls for social welfare reform and welfare provisions for the poor. Now, while the concept of a welfare state isn't realised until after the Second World War, as I've mentioned earlier on, when we see the election of Clement Attlee in the Labour government, which we'll get to, I believe, later on, this period still lays much of the groundwork for later developments in this welfare reform and this welfare establishment. So, before the 20th century, we can see that the British tax system is relatively what we call regressive. What we mean by regressive is that it relies on heavy customs duties, it relies on heavy excise taxes, and also on property taxes, which places a disproportionate burden on the working class. So a regressive tax system is one that places the heaviest burden on those that are earning the least amount in terms of within the class system. A more progressive tax system is one that increases, essentially places a progressive amount of burden on those who get progressively more wealthy within a society. So it's the sort of opposite end to the spectrum. As part of an increasing realization that the state had a significant role in social welfare, both the Liberal Party under people like Gladstone and the Conservatives under people like Benjamin Disraeli began to make changes in terms of taxation policy. So, for example, we get land taxes. Landowners had long been exempt from paying taxes on the wealth that they generated from their land. But in the 1900s, we see land tax reform become a significant and central issue. Some of this reform was carried out through incremental land taxation measures, but tariff reform, which would have raised money through taxes on imports, became also a highly controversial issue. And we've noted this already, thinking about the debates, political debates surrounding free trade and laissez-faire economics and protectionism as a major player in a number of these early 20th century elections. We also get the 1909 People's Budget. The Liberal government under David Lloyd George introduces the People's Budget in 1909, which aims to fund social reforms by raising taxes on the rich. This introduces a progressive income tax and inheritance taxes, which taxes the wealthy more heavily than that of the poor. Essentially the first attempt at creating what we would describe as a progressive taxation system in Britain. And this marks a fundamental shift. The People's Budget is a fundamental shift towards using taxation as a tool for social reform. Now, the People's Budget, as you can imagine, faces severe opposition, particularly from members of the House of Lords, which try to block the People's Budget, and this leads to a constitutional crisis which culminates in the Parliament Act of 1911. The Parliament Act of 1911 limits the power of the House of Lords and gives the House of Commons greater control over fiscal policy. And then we'll get a further piece of legislation in 1949, which creates even greater reductions in the powers of the House of Lords, of the upper house. So, finally then, let's start thinking about welfare reforms. By 1914, a series of welfare reforms had been introduced, and this begins to essentially lead to the establishment of the foundations for a state system that is based on social security and benefits. So, for example, we get the 1908 Old Age Pensions Act, which is the first major step in the development of a welfare state. It provides a small, non-contributory pension to elderly people over the age of 70 who are living in poverty. Most pensions were modest, but they were still, nevertheless, a major departure from the past and a major introduction of a national welfare scheme that is funded by taxes that are introduced by the Liberal government. We also get in 1911 probably the most important welfare reform up to the year 1914, which is the 1911 National Insurance Act, which creates a system of health insurance and unemployment insurance for workers. The act requires that workers, employers, and the government will contribute to a fund that would provide workers with medical care and income during periods of unemployment. Now, again, we have to contextualize this within the broader historical narrative that while this is limited in terms of its scope, it only covers certain industries and it would only cover the poorest workers, it's still a major breakthrough in terms of the state involvement in social welfare. Finally then, let's think about some of the local initiatives and social work movements that we see. In cities like London, organisations like Toynbee Hall provide services and education to the poor and promote the idea of social reform and integrating the middle class into working class neighbourhoods. This becomes known as the settlement movement, and it's part of a broader movement in which the wealthy and educated sought to improve the conditions of the urban poor through this kind of direct involvement. And then finally we see that there is a number of charitable organisations, often led by religious groups and wealthy philanthropists. These groups would provide assistance in areas like healthcare, housing and employment services, particularly in those of the worst slums within industrial cities within Great Britain.